Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to have kind of a steamy little topic that everybody has on their mind. The question is how much they have it on their mind. Sometimes maybe too much. Sex on the brain is usually something that can maybe cause more problems than it helps. On the program today, we are certainly going to hear great advice from someone who has more than 25 years in relationship therapy, who has helped more than 1,000 couples in long-term relationships get a satisfying love life that can be elusive. Advice is plentiful, as I said earlier, but overwhelmingly focuses on techniques to spice up the bedroom and make things new and exciting. But what if, however, this advice is fundamentally misunderstood, and the needs of men and women in committed relationships are certainly something that need to be examined as a whole? Well, we're going to be talking about that today with his new book, Love Worth Making, How to Have Ridiculously Great Sex and Long-Lasting Relationships. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Dr. Stephen Snyder.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you for joining us here on the program. You know, we've had this topic here on our program quite a few times, and usually it's always women. And I thought it was kind of bold that here we're finally having a man step up to bat and, kind of give his point of view. And first of all, as I was reading the book, and it was fun. I was kind of bouncing around the different chapters. But the one thing that really cleared its head was the assumptions we have about this whole thing. The preconceptions about what sex is, what it should be like in relationships,
Yep.
And when it doesn't happen, somehow we feel fundamentally flawed, and that's really where the problems begin, I think.
I think so. In my book, I call it the script. There's the conventional script, which is a little bit like couples dancing. The man's going to ask the woman to dance, and he's going to do most of the leading and deciding and initiating, and she's going to be the main object of attention and admiration. And eventually it's going to proceed from foreplay to usually intercourse to orgasm, and that script has to be followed, otherwise everybody feels that they're missing out. And it does have a certain amount of tyranny to it.
Absolutely. And I was thinking, it made me think about a lot of things, like, sometimes how come it was, and I remember this years ago, where I'd get into a relationship and, for instance, the sex would be really good and be fairly frequent, but then after a while I would kind of seem to lose interest, and I started thinking, am I just somebody who's interested in the hunt? I mean, what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a great question. All psychology is biography, ultimately. Because to devote that much passion to talking about a subject, you have to, it has to come from somewhere. And in my case, the passion came from being a man in a long-term relationship. I've been married for 27 years, and hearing all about this and thinking, this just doesn't really make sense in terms of what I experience and what I advise and counsel my couples to experience. What you're talking about is the disappearance of that kind of desire, because there is a kind of desire which says, I've got to have you. I've got to have you now. I want you now. And all romance novels have to do with this, and most sexual media has to do with this. For better or for worse, it doesn't last forever, and just about every long-term couple knows this. You no longer have the feeling of, I've got to have you now. You have the feeling of, if I had you tomorrow, it'd be just fine. Or as my colleague Esther Perel is famous for saying, how can you desire what you already have? What you already have.
Right, exactly.
Because you don't have the thrill of seeing them naked for the first time. You don't have the thrill of it being vaguely forbidden because you've never gotten them naked before. And you don't have that thrill of the fact that you've just met. One of the strange things about human mating is that we don't tend to fall in love with people we've known since kindergarten. We tend to fall in love with relative strangers, which is a little weird when you think about it, but that's how human mating goes. So you fall in love with and you have sex with somebody you really hardly know, but it's such a powerful feeling. And then you get to know them and your selves get involved and the two selves get in conflict and all sorts of stuff happens, which we can talk about at length. And then what happens? What's the fate of desire? Well, the usual fate of desire is that desire really, really does fade. So the big thing that I think is new in my book is the idea that you don't need desire in order to have great sex. And I don't think many people are saying that. I think most people are saying, how can we bring back desire? Maybe we can go on a sexy destination. Maybe we can have a fantasy we can share. Maybe we get a new sex toy or something. And I have a serious bias as a sex therapist, which is that those things don't work. Or if they do work, they work for a week and a half. And then your drawer is full of sex toys, but you're right back where you started and you get a little discouraged. So my book says, don't try to soup up or juice up or recover desire. Just go ahead and have good sex. And there's
Right.
ways to do that.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing, when we talk about, as I was alluding to earlier, about the idea that we seem to have these preconceptions about what sex is in relationships. That somehow that, let's say that you're in a long-term relationship and maybe it started out where it was a few times a week or more, who knows.
Right.
And then, a year, 2 years later, it starts waning to the point that maybe it might be a year before you have sex again. But, you don't seem to be, as you were saying earlier, as much in desire of it. And it's nobody's real fault about that, but it's the idea that you had something that you wanted, but now there it is.
Exactly. But that's a natural course of it. It is important for couples to have sex regularly. Usually, I don't want to be too doctrinaire about it since we're talking about not having to stick to a script, but there is an effect that does happen if a couple's living under the same roof or sharing the same bed and not having sex on a somewhat frequent basis, which is they begin to feel like siblings to each other. And I think this is biology. In biology, it's called the Westermarck Effect, which is that you don't tend to desire your siblings because they've been hanging around so long. And so somebody hangs around so long around you and you don't have sex with them, they feel your brain reads them as sibling. So it is really, really important to keep having sex. And so the question then is how to do that. We can get into the details of how to do that. But I usually advise couples, you don't want to let it slip down too far below once a week.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, you talk about untying sex knots. Now, first of all, what is a sex knot? How does that rear itself, and what do we do there?
Okay, sex knot. I'm the first guy to talk about sex knots, although other people have talked about it from different perspective. I actually stole the term from a guy named R.D. Laing. I'm probably dating myself. He was in the 70s. He was a psychiatrist who wrote a book called Knots, about how people tie themselves up in knots in relationships. People tie themselves up in knots in sexual relationships. I'll give you the classic example. A woman wants to feel desired, and she doesn't feel desired by her husband. He just loafs around on the couch, and he never takes her out to dinner, and he never tells her she's beautiful, and he never initiates sex. She gets upset. It's an understandable reaction because almost every woman that I've talked to from all over the world really, really, really wants and needs to feel desired. It's very fundamental, even more than men do. And he realizes that she's upset, and his natural reaction is to run away because he doesn't want to be with somebody who's upset with him. But that's totally paradoxical because the only reason she's upset with him is because he ran away. So he runs away. He'll go, hide behind the newspaper or not want to deal with her or stay late at the office, and that makes her even more upset. And the more upset she gets, the more he runs away, and so on and so on and so on, and you tie this knot tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. And that's what it's an example of what I mean by a sex knot. It's where everybody's natural inclinations and natural reactions just get the thing into a worse and worse situation. This is the source of most sexual problems. That's why they can be a little difficult to untie by yourself. Actually, in my book, I have an appendix in the back with a list of the 11 most common sex knots with recipes for how to untie them. So that's something that's new about this book. If you want, I'll tell you about another sex knot.
Absolutely, please.
Yeah. It's kind of been a hobby of mine for years in the office is classifying and organizing and trying to understand these things. A guy, let's say he's in a long-distance relationship. They only see each other maybe every 2 or 3 weeks. She comes in flies in, it's Friday, he's really happy to see her, but he realizes they really better have some good sex because this sex that they're going to have is going to have to tide them over for the next 3 weeks, and she's only there for a couple of days. His sexual mind doesn't like that feeling of pressure because the sexual mind really doesn't like having any agenda at all. It just wants to just hang out and do whatever it wants to do. So the fact that it's being told you better have really, really good sex with this person, it makes it turn off. So he's going to tend to maybe be slower to get his erection. And that's going to freak him out. He's going to say, this isn't going to work. Unfortunately, erections only happen when the guy's happy. So he's not going to be happy at that point, and that's going to keep his erection from happening even more. That's the first part of the knot. The second part of the knot, she's going to see this. She's going to see the guy is struggling to keep an erection, and she's going to think, he doesn't desire me. She's going to get upset. He's going to see that she's upset, and he's going to get even more unhappy, and he's going to be even more unlikely to have an erection. So you can see how this thing just goes again, around and around and around, and it just descends into chaos. And these knots are everywhere with couples.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's like I said, it was fascinating as I was reading in your book about these different things here because, again, about assumptions. And one of the things I'd like to talk about that I was really surprised by was sex and religion. What
Yes.
about that?
I mean, I was so pleased when I found out I was going to be on this show, and I found out that you'll have a whole section on religion and spirituality, and I thought, oh, man, I'm so there.
Well, there you go.
Yeah,
well, because we like to honor, pretty much a holistic point of view instead of just one view, because there are different ways that you approach this. I mean, when you think about, for instance, sex in America, versus the way it is around most of the world, it's much different and much more taboo in many ways, than it is, for instance, in France or in South America, stuff like
Sure.
that. And I know I've been around. And the fact that, you have to be in a monogamous relationship, so it seems, and you have to. We're back to the preconceptions, and a lot of it has to do with the religious point of view here, I think, in America about all that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been said that we are really like we have a dissociative disorder when it comes to sexuality, because on the one hand, we are the most sexually in-your-face culture that has ever lived. Where sexuality is literally used to sell every single product under the sun. And as a result of consumerism and capitalism and commercialism and all that stuff, sex is just in your face all the time because it tends to get attention, and that's what it's all about in publicity and marketing. At the same time, we're a deeply, deeply conservative culture as well. And unlike the Europeans, for whom having an affair, it's your spouse's private matter, and as long as they don't discuss it with the children, I don't worry about it so much. We Americans tend to be highly, highly moralistic about this. Full disclosure, I'm an American. I have colleagues all over the world, and they say, why are you Americans so hung up about this? And I go, I don't know. It's just it's just how we feel. Something about the vibration in America, and I'm a traditionally religious person myself, and I always get asked, how does that go together with being a sex therapist? And what I tell people is they're both about relationships. One is about your relationship with, I guess, God, however you conceive him, or her, or whatever. And the other is your relationship with your partner. And in both cases, you're tending to your relationship. And I find, maybe I'm a little weird, but there's not that much difference between cultivating a spiritual connection in religious practice and cultivating a sexual connection in a relationship. Let me tell you what I mean. Everyone who's ever had a religious awakening knows that there's this wonderful feeling. It's in love. You're in love with the universe, and the universe is in love with you, and you just want to talk about it. And it's just it's like the sun comes out, and you feel like you know where you belong in the world. But then that fades too. Religious people generally know that your faith or your feeling of inspiration in the relationship does come and go. It's not a steady thing because, you're different and your needs are different, and you're constantly having to open yourself up to it again. And you don't know where it's going to come from or where you're going to find it. But you have faith after a few rounds of this that you will find it again, and that when you find it, it'll be something different. It's the same thing in a sexual relationship. Once that initial stage of I've got to have you now passes, sex is something that you know has potential for the two of you, and sometimes you'll feel strongly turned on and strongly inspired and strongly validated, and other times it'll just be nice. And worship is a lot like that. Sometimes you feel strongly validated, and other times it's just nice. So to me, they feel very, very similar. I don't know how many other people share that feeling, but we're going to find out now that the book is launching, and it's one of the things that I hope to get some kind of dialogue with people. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book. Is because,
and I was going to say, too, here's what's really unique, and it was funny because just before this interview came along, and I've encountered this a couple of times when we think about people who are approaching midlife, and this was actually coming from men, the idea, well, yeah, I'd like to kind of go out and find somebody to date and get connected with, but it isn't so much about the sex anymore. It's like I want somebody that I can actually talk with and have a good conversation with and share time with, that sex part doesn't seem to be as important to them.
Yeah.
Now, I know our listeners are going to feel alarmed by that. What's wrong with these guys? But I'm telling you, these are common, healthy guys that are saying things like this. That It isn't like what we were when we were teenagers, we're on the hunt, this is a thing, a notch on the bedpost kind of a thing. We got to get the girl, blah, blah, blah. It's more about now. It's more important that I find somebody that, as you were saying, I can connect with, and it doesn't have to be a physical connection.
Well, there is an old saying among sex therapists, is that men, as they age, they become more like women. And what I think this means is that they become more integrated. The pieces actually are in dialogue with each other. Whereas for a young man, the pieces really are not in dialogue very much. You've got this strong response system which responds to fantasy or experience of seeing something that just turns you on, and once that gets in your head, it just takes over, and you become really a driven creature. That's just not the same for an older man. There's wide variation, but most older men go, I've kind of been there and done that a few times in my life where I go to bed with somebody who is just like, they knock my socks off in terms of their body, but just like after a little while I get nothing to talk about with them, and it's a pain in the neck, and you know what, it's not worth it. In that respect, they're like most women always have been, where their sexuality is more integrated with the rest of who they are. For a man, that takes a while for that to happen, for that integration to occur. Does what I'm saying make sense to you?
Absolutely. Now, since we're on this topic, you talk about a thing called simmering. What is that?
Oh, so happy you mentioned it. Because earlier on the show, we talked about how does a couple manage to cultivate an erotic connection in the absence of much desire. So, simmering is getting excited together for a relatively brief period of time, maybe a minute, maybe 2 minutes max, under circumstances where it's clear you're not going to have sex. So it's stepping out of the whole script of desire, arousal, sex, orgasm. Throw away that script. What we're saying is we're just going to enjoy arousal. As I say, I hope that Verizon doesn't mind this, because it's the Verizon FiOS, their fiber optic system, FiOS. This is sex FiOS, FiOS, for its own sake. So just getting excited for its own sake. Now, in order to know how to do that, you have to understand what excitement really is. And it's a difficult thing to put into words. Most people gauge excitement just by what's happening in their body. Am I wet? Am I hard? But you don't really have to be that excited for that to happen. What you really want is the psychological attributes of excitement. You want to lose some IQ points. You want to become a little goofier. You want to become a little just spontaneously happy, like, oh, yeah, I like that. You want to become a little more selfish, a little more interested in your own needs. This really feels good. I want to keep on doing it, rather than how can I make this other person happy. A little more selfish, a little less generous, a little more immature. The phone rings. You don't really care who's calling. You don't really care what you've got to do a half an hour from now. You're just in the moment. And that's what arousal does. That's why most traditions, most civilizations try and make sure that their teenagers don't do much sex, because they know it distracts them from their studies. Because arousal makes us more irresponsible and less mature. So as a couple, you want to get a little more irresponsible, a little less mature, a little more selfish, a little more grabby, a little more happy, in other words, aroused, with each other, even under situations when you're not going to have sex. The classic ones are heading out the door in the morning. Most couples kiss each other goodbye. I usually advise couples in my office, simmer each other goodbye. A hand on a breast, a hand around the waist. Bury your face in the partner's hair. Breathe together. Let your bodies mold together, a little like two teenagers. And enjoy it. Feel excited. Take a deep breath. Look each other deeply in the eyes and say, oh, that was good. All right, got to go.
Right.
The other is at bedtime. You're both exhausted, and you got to get to bed, otherwise you're not going to be able to get enough sleep to be awake at work the next morning, and you don't have the energy to have sex. Again, same kind of thing, mold together, inhale each other's scent, maybe some feeling, maybe some grinding, maybe some touching, get excited, and go, oh, that was good. Let's go to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to, in order to do that, you have to appreciate the fact that there's a whole realm of arousal which doesn't automatically lead to sex, and that's what most couples do when they first get together. They're on a date, they're at a restaurant, they're playing footsie with each other, they're feeling excited. And most couples forget to do that after a few years. They think, okay, are we going to have sex tonight? If so, then I'll let myself get excited. The rest of the time I don't even think about getting excited. So if couples, like most American couples these days, are having sex maybe about once a week, that's what the statistics tell us, it's not enough, really. You really need to be simmering. So if you're bringing it to a boil, just to bring the analogy around, if you're bringing it to a boil once a week, you want to simmer it a few times in between. And that just kind of keeps the erotic climate warm. Otherwise, you're bringing it to a boil, but it's been cold all week. That's kind of unnatural.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you bring that up and how important that is to, get yourself aroused. But it doesn't necessarily have to lead to sex, and it certainly doesn't have to lead to an orgasm, which is another assumption. But
yeah, absolutely, and that's a thing that bedevils a lot of women,
mm-hmm.
because a lot of women, if their husband perhaps wants sex a little bit more than they do, a lot of women think, I better not wear anything sexy to bed because he might get hard. And he might get aroused, and then he's going to get frustrated, which is ridiculous because we guys, we like being aroused. We like being excited. And so there's no reason to avoid doing that. You just tell your husband, I'm not up for sex, but, we could certainly get excited together. And then the guy says, well, what if I want to come? Woman says, okay, if you want to come, come. There's a technique that I talk about in the book. I don't know if you looked at that part where it's called lazy sex.
Right. Actually, I
lazy
did.
And a lot of couples discover that on their own. And a lot of couples, when I talk to them about it, they look at me like I've got three heads. But just for your radio audience, lazy sex is when one person wants to have an orgasm because they feel like it and they don't want to go to sleep without having it, and it makes sense, they're hungry for it. And the other couple is just really tired and is not interested, and then say it's the woman, she doesn't want to have intercourse because she's got to get up and urinate afterwards so she doesn't get an urinary infection, and it's just a whole lot of stuff to take care of, and she doesn't really feel like dealing with that. And the guy wants to have an orgasm, so here's what I recommend. He lies on his back, and she sides up to him, rubs her body against his, strokes his chest, they kiss, make out, and he takes some lubricant in his other hand and gives himself an orgasm.
There you go.
There you go. Lazy sex. Everybody gets what they want. She doesn't have to get up afterwards, and he gets an orgasm. And most people who try this say, you know what, it's not 100% of sex, but it's got about 75% of the ingredients. You're both there. We've got the scent. We've got the body feeling and everything. It's just a different actual thing providing friction to the genitals. But, hell, it's not such a big difference. The alternative for most guys, which most guys do, if they feel frustrated, if their wife doesn't want sex, they go off to the bathroom, they look at porn on their phone, and it's cold in there. It's lonely. Nobody wants to do that. So, I mean, if they really had a choice. So I tell guys, you just bring the orgasm to bed with your partner. All that's necessary is to realize that once you get married, it doesn't prohibit you from touching your own genitals when you're with your partner.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Like I said, this book actually will hold a lot of amazing, I would almost call them discoveries versus the common kind of books and conversations we've had out there about this.
That's why I wrote it.
Yeah, and I want to applaud you. It's been very entertaining as well, and actually quite funny, because we think to ourselves, why do we think this way, and why did we come to those conclusions in the first place?
Yeah.
And once you realize, wow, okay, I guess things aren't as bad as I had thought they were, then you start moving in the right direction and go, okay, well, let's see how we can go ahead and deal with this, in a very natural, fun, and progressively, what do I want to say? Not inspirational is the word, but like the journey, if you will.
I like inspirational.
Mm-hmm.
I like inspirational. But again, I'm a religious guy.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's all part of the same picture. At the beginning, for most people, when they get together, there's a feeling that sex is a reward. It's a tremendous feeling of reward. How I'm in a relationship, this person is attracted to me, I'm attracted to them. Thank God we can have sex. That's a great reward here. It's wonderful. Later on, if unfortunately, sex can start to feel like an obligation. My husband wants sex, but I guess I'm kind of obliged to. Now, that's a turnoff. That's no good. So on the one hand, reward. On the other hand, obligation. My vision is something in the middle. And if you're not religious, then you may have a little trouble following me, but I think most people will have a sense of what I'm saying, which is in the middle between reward and obligation is sacrament. So sex is a sacrament. Most couples, it's as if in their relationship they have their own kind of private religion with its own rituals, and it's meaningful in the same way that a religion is. It provides structure and meaning for their lives. It's a place where they belong, where they can be themselves. It challenges them, certainly, and it sometimes frustrates them like anything else, and it provides satisfaction, and they can see themselves the framework of their lives. They've been young, they're in their middle years, they're going to get older. This somehow frames their whole existence and gives it meaning. And sex is a sacrament within this private religion that every couple has. And it's a meaningful sacrament. And sometimes, like any sacrament, it's filled with magnificent meaning, and sometimes you're holding the place for the next time when it happens. But it's important, I think, to hold that place. And I think most religions say the same thing, that even if you're not really in the mood to pray, you just want to open yourself up to it and see what happens.
Absolutely. Well, I know that people will really enjoy this. They'll certainly find a lot of assumptions kind of being broken away, for instance. And the book is called Love Worth Making. It's how to have ridiculously great sex in a long-lasting relationship. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Stephen Snyder. Thank you for being on the program today. Is there a website people can go to find out about the book and more about your work?
It's easy to find. It's loveworthmaking.com.
Very good. Dr. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today.
Daniel, it's a pleasure. Thank you very, very much.
You bet.
Bye-bye.
I want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You can also discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to stay up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.